After the gold rush, the American Southwest experienced a time of lawlessness, a time of violence, a transitional period in which Mexican American people and Native American people were forced to take a position of disenfranchisement in a place where they were once in charge. Extreme violence, injustice, white supremacy, and so on and so forth. In this lecture, I am going to talk about social banditry, anti-Mexican sentiment, and Mexican Americans in the Civil War. So let's begin. This image that you see here in the title page, you can see an image of soldiers, specifically Confederate soldiers from Texas, fighting during the Civil War. You can also see a depiction of Joaquin Murrieta on the top left-hand side of this slide. And you can also see a picture that says Joaquin Valenzuela's head in a yard in the middle picture. Mexican American people were discriminated in many different ways by the population, by the law enforcement authorities, and many of them ended up losing their land. And for those that decided to fight back, ended up getting lynched, or in some cases just because of their racial relationship to Mexican people, they would end up in a situation where they would not get a fair trial or a trial at all to defend themselves. This next slide, you can see two names. One is Joaquin Murrieta. On the top, and then you can see a newspaper ad that talks about Joaquin Murrieta to be executed as a spectacle. So let's look into the character of Joaquin Murrieta. There's an organization here in California that has members who claim to be descendants of Joaquin Murrieta. Joaquin Murrieta was an outlaw during the gold rush in California, who is known for engaging in violence against people, but more so because he was politically aware and claimed that he was taking revenge for the abuses against Mexican people and minors in California. Joaquin Murrieta is known as a hero for many. And so the things that he did to defend the rights of Mexican people and Native American people. Joaquin Murrieta was interviewed a few times, and in your primary documents you can see part of his interview, or his interviews, where he speaks about these issues. Joaquin Murrieta is originally from the state of Sonora in Mexico, specifically near Hermosillo, which is the capital of the state of Sonora. And he comes to California during the gold rush looking for gold. There are two versions of Joaquin Murrieta, or the origins of Joaquin Murrieta. One is based on a novel that was written by a Cherokee person by the name of John Rolling Ridge, or Yellowbird, in 1854, by the title of The Life and Adventure of Joaquin Murrieta, the Celebrated California Bandit. His novel talks about the legend of Joaquin Murrieta, and it makes Joaquin Murrieta seem like a Mexican Robin Hood. This is what makes Joaquin Murrieta famous. In this novel, Yellowbird discusses the life of crime of Joaquin Murrieta, and Yellowbird talks about how a group of Americans who were jealous of Joaquin Murrieta's success in mining beat him up and raped his wife and left him for dead. After this, Joaquin Murrieta leaves his mining claim and becomes a car dealer. But when he's a car dealer, according to the novel by Yellowbird, he's accused of stealing a horse who he had borrowed from his brother-in-law. And from this, what happens is that these people, that vigilantes, go after him and torture him and get the truth out of him on where he got the horse. He says that he got the horse from his brother, and because of this, the vigilante group goes to his home, his brother's home, and drag his brother out and hang him on the spot. According to the novel, this is the point of no return for Joaquin Murrieta. This is where he becomes an outlaw and takes justice into his own hands. He becomes a victim of prejudice, of discrimination, after being whipped and tortured. And because of this, Joaquin Murrieta takes it upon himself to take revenge for these things. This is according to the novel. This is what the novel says, and this is what most people think about Joaquin Murrieta. The truth is that Joaquin Murrieta comes from Hermosillo. He was born in Hermosillo, Sonora, not Hermosillo, Sonora, but around Hermosillo, Sonora, in a small town around 1830. He comes to California closer to 1850 with his wife, Rosa Felix, and her brothers, looking for gold like many other people. On February 1848, as we know, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was signed, and this place changes forever. Because of that, because of the discovery of gold and this migration, American miners flood California, and they create very tense situations between them and Mexican miners. Many Mexican miners and Native American people are driven out of their claims, and this creates all kinds of issues. In a previous lecture, I talked about the gold rush and how the 1850 foreign miners tax is one example of how Anglo miners feel about the success of California miners and Sonora miners. And this is somewhat what influences the story of Joaquin Murrieta. The facts is that Joaquin Murrieta's brother-in-law, Claudio Felix. This is according to Contra Costa County Historical Society records. Claudio Flores was arrested for stealing another person's gold in 1849. And by 1850, Claudio Felix, this is Joaquin Murrieta's brother-in-law, was a leader of a gang that robbed travelers. Most of the travelers that were robbed were Chinese American. On September of 1851, Claudio Felix was killed, and Joaquin Murrieta took over the gang of his brother-in-law. As Joaquin Murrieta becomes the leader of this group of criminals, a veteran of the Mexican-American War who had lost 2 fingers during a firefight during the war, joins Joaquin Murrieta's gang. The name of this gentleman is Three Finger Jack. It is believed with the Murrieta and Three Finger Jack and the rest of his group targeted miners, taking horses, using lassos, and killing them and stealing their gold. According to some sources, Murrieta's gang targeted mainly Chinese miners, like I said. California lawman Harry Love went after Murrieta. Harry Love was a veteran of the U.S.-Mexican War, and he had experience fighting guerrilla warfare in Mexico during the war. It is known that in 1853, a gang that was associated with Joaquin Murrieta killed 22 miners, mostly Chinese American people. Eventually, Joaquin Murrieta ends up getting killed in a shootout, according to the San Francisco Chronicle in San Joaquin Valley in 1853. Later on, Joaquin Murrieta disappears, but somehow Joaquin Murrieta's head appears in a jar full of whiskey and is used as a souvenir in different mining towns to eventually end up in San Francisco, where it's displayed in a saloon where people are paying $1 to see it. That's the image that you saw in the first slide of this lecture. There's stories about this head, and it's believed that this head was cursed in the stories that people tell. Apparently, the rangers who fired and killed him had appearances of Joaquin Murrieta's spirit, and the shadows of Joaquin Murrieta will come to them and say, "I want my head back." From 1865 to 1906, the head was displayed in a museum in San Francisco. In 1906, we have a big earthquake that happens in San Francisco, and this is when the head of Joaquin Murrieta disappears. Joaquin Murrieta is a hero to Chicanos, to Mexican Americans, a symbol of resistance, and we are still questioning where he died and how he died, because one of the things that happened is that many people that might not be even named Murrieta or Joaquin, but just because they were Mexican, they were given or nicknamed the same name. Therefore, it's possible that many crimes that were committed were attributed to Joaquin Murrieta, when in reality, maybe other people were the ones committing these crimes. The 1998 film, The Mask of El Zorro, is based on partially the character of Joaquin Murrieta. It is believed that other characters like Batman are also somewhat based on this story. So Joaquin Murrieta becomes this character that is loved by some, hated by others, Nevertheless, Joaquin Murrieta is a social bandit that is given credit for fighting consciously for the rights and defending Mexican and Mexican American people. Whether he was a criminal and he committed crimes, that's not a question, but there are times in history when an ethnic group or a group of people are experiencing violence, unfairness, and they have the need for a hero. And this is where Joaquin Murrieta becomes bigger than life. A second character that I want to point out that is also as important is Tiburcio Vázquez. Tiburcio Vázquez is also a social bandit. Unlike Joaquin Murrieta, Tiburcio Vázquez was born in the capital of Mexican California, in Monterrey, on August 11, 1835. Tiburcio Vázquez was a descendant from one of the earliest settlers in California, and his great-grandfather arrived as a young man with the ANZA expedition in 1776. He was educated formally and could speak, read, and write in English. His criminal activity begins in 1852 when he was between the age of 16 and 17. He's hanging out with his cousin Anastasio Garcia at a fandango, a fiesta, a party, where an Anglo by the name of Constable William Harmount is killed. And even though Tiburcio Vázquez or his cousin Anastasio Garcia were not involved, both of these gentlemen flee the scene because they know how things work at this time, and they do not want to be involved. It is known that one of Vázquez's friends stays, and his friend Jose Higuera ends up getting lynched the same night by a vigilante group. This could have been the fate of Tiburcio Vázquez. So Tiburcio Vázquez and his cousin Anastasio Garcia end up hiding in the hills, and because his cousin Anastasio Garcia is already familiar with the life of crime, eventually Tiburcio Vázquez learns the way of crime and joins the group. This group ends up stealing horses, California. Eventually, by 1857, Tiburcio Vázquez gets arrested in Los Angeles. He serves some years in San Quentin prison, escapes by 1859. He's recaptured. He's released by 1863, and then he continues to engage in crime. Again, he's arrested in 1867. He's released, and by 1871 he escapes. Tiburcio Vázquez was a man that was very pleasant to talk to, and he was a womanizer. He had many women that liked him, and he oftentimes got into trouble because of women. In 1873, he's accused of stealing $200 in gold and killing 3 people. At this point, the governor of California, by the name of Newton Booth, offers a $1,000 reward for the arrest of Tiburcio Vázquez. Eventually, by the year 1873, Mauricio Vasquez and his gang are stealing so much from different stores that his reward goes all the way up to $15,000. Eventually, Mauricio Vasquez becomes a celebrity when he's locked up in jail. And while he's in jail, he uses his celebrity status to sell pictures with his autograph on them. And he uses the money that he raises from that to pay his legal defense. In 1875, he makes a request to the governor to give him clemency, meaning to stop any type of execution of his person. But the trial goes forward. He's denied clemency by the governor, and in 1875, he is lynched or hung by Santa Clara Sheriff John H. Adams. Eventually, Tiburcio Vasquez is buried at the old Santa Clara Mission Cemetery in Santa Clara, California. Tiburcio Vasquez, like Joaquin Murrieta, become bigger than life legends that represent the experiences of Mexican American people following the Mexican American War and the occupation of this territory of California by people from the United States. This will not be the only people that experience this type of violence, but this is all happening after the U.S.-Mexican War. Texas is experiencing a period of racism, white supremacy, anti-Mexican sentiment, where Mexican people are suspects of being anti-American. One of the issues that comes out of this period is the issue of land disputes, mostly in South Texas. And because of the history of Texas, Mexican people, without mattering what side of the war they were on, become suspects and become people that are not fully trusted by white supremacists in Texas. Texas was a state where 1/4 of all Anglos living in Texas in these years, in the 1850s, where 1/4 of Anglos were slave owners. 80% of the people of Texas came from state owning slaves. So the ideas that they brought with them were pretty much racist, white supremacist, and so on and so forth. Texas Revolution, pro-slavery, and the lack of trust on Mexicans influence how these things happen. In some towns in Texas, local governments and counties pass legislation to oppress Mexican people. For example, in 1854, the town of Seguin prohibited the association of Mexicans and blacks and of Mexicans entering or residing in Texas. 8 other Texas counties passed similar laws. Austin, Texas, had a citizens committee who went to the city council and made a statement where they referred to mixed race people and Mexican people, who they referred to as half Negro and half Indian greasers, to live in the next 10 days from the state of Texas or from this town. Acts of Anglos and police authorities forced the removal of Mexicans from Colorado and Matagorda counties in Texas because they concluded that Mexicans had aided a slave insurrection. And Texas was a place that was used as a jumping board, was a southern underground railroad way for slaves to escape. And this brought a whole another layer of mistrust of white slave owners. Uvalde County, west of San Antonio, prohibited Tejanos from passing through this area without a passport. This is not all. Another issue that comes out of this period is something called the card words. In the counties of Goliath and Karnes County, southeast of San Antonio, there is, at this time in history, a period of competition between Anglos and Mexicans transporting goods across the state. In Manahuila Creek in Goliath County, Anglo-Texans, heavily armed, wearing masks, intercept and destroy Mexican cart property and injure some of the Mexican car drivers or fleteros. Nothing was done to the Anglo criminals. Eventually, up to 75 Mexican or Tejano car drivers were killed. Eventually, the Mexican government intervened, and the Texas government put aside monies to intervene in this issue, yet the violence continued, and nobody was ever held responsible for the killing of 75 Tejanos in this time of competition. Texas was a very crazy place, a very racist place, a very anti-Mexican place following the U.S.-Mexican War. So California and Texas being two places that had been populated really fast by people from the United States were two epicenters of racism and white supremacy for Mexican and Mexican American people, as well as Native American people and blacks. But we can also add Asian American people. Yes, like in California, in Texas, there are a couple of characters. There are more, but these are two very well-known ones who also engage in social banditry, in defending the rights of themselves and the Mexican population of Texas. The first one is Juan Nepomuceno Cortina, born in Camargo, Tamaulipas in 1824. He is a prominent landowner from a very wealthy land-owning family in the border region. He becomes a soldier during the U.S.-Mexican War, who fights against Taylor at Palo Alto and Razaca de la Palma battles. After the war, Cortina becomes a U.S. citizen under the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, and later on he's hired by the U.S. Quartermaster Corps. In 1850, he participates in the campaign to create a Republic of Sierra Madre out of the Rio Grande region, south of New Mexico. In 1855, his family moves to El Espiritu Santo land grant in Brownsville, Texas, along the Nueces River. There he becomes a cattle rancher and earns the nickname of Cheno. He was part of the Democratic Party with support of Tejanos. In 1859, Juan Nepomuceno Cortina earns his reputation as a defender of Tejanos when he witnesses Brownsville Marshal Bob Spears, an ex-Texas Ranger, Pistol Whip, and Old Vaquero, who used to work within his ranch. And this Marshal ends up hitting this Tejano vaquero until he is knocked unconscious and bleeding. Cortina shoots spears and takes the vaquero to his mom's ranch, and then he goes south of the border into Mexico. Later on, Juan Nepomuceno Cortina comes back as a leader of a group of over 70 Tejanos to Brownsville, where he frees a dozen jailed Tejanos and kills 3 Anglos. As he rode away, he shouts, "Mueran los gringos," death to the gringos. This marked the beginning of the Cortina War, which happens from 1859 to 1869 for about 10 years. He claims that he's fighting for the rights of Tejanos under the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo and all of the abuses Tejanos experienced since the 1830s. Eventually, he defeats a group of Texas Rangers and is persecuted or is chased into Mexico. By the end, he's able to raise a group of about 400 people who support his causes, to the point that he ends up fighting against the U.S. Army under the leadership of Colonel Robert E. Lee, who will later become a very important figure in the U.S. Civil War, as well as Texas Rangers. He was able to evade them for a while, but eventually he was able to be chased down to the point that he wasn't able to fight them anymore. Later on, he goes into Mexico. The U.S. wants him. Texas wants him. But he gets involved in politics in Mexico. And in the 1860s, Juan Nepomuceno Cortina ends up helping Mexico to fight against the French intervention, Cinco de Mayo, to later become the military governor of Tamaulipas and the mayor of Matamoros in the state of Tamaulipas, which is the border state south of Texas, one of the border states. In 1876, he's arrested and taken to Mexico City. He's trying to have a deal with the state of Texas. However, the then president of Mexico, Porfirio Diaz, intervenes for him and proposes that Juan Nepomuceno Cortina, spends the last days of his life in home arrest in Azcapotzalco in Mexico, in central Mexico, in the state of Mexico, near Mexico City. And this is because Juan Nepomuceno Cortina is already older and he's suffering from rheumatism and not doing so well with his health. The last example that I have here for you as a social bandit is Gregorio Cortés. Gregorio Cortés was born in Matamoros in 1875, moves to Manor, Texas, when he was 2 years old. Cortés ends up being a farmer and a ranch hand. On June 12, 1901, the sheriff is looking for a horse thief that is described as a medium-sized Mexican. Let me remind you that many Mexicans, including Cortés, fit that given description. Cortés had made a horse trade with a friend of his recently, and this was suspicious to the sheriff. The sheriff, by the name of Sheriff Morris, and his 2 deputies, Bonnie and Quati, and the interpreter by the name of John Trimmel, come to Cortés's home and question him about his recent trade in front of various family members, including his brother Ronaldo. when Gregorio Cortes is being questioned by the sheriff and the translations are being made, and they ask him about this horse, Cortes responds, "There is no reason to arrest me." But the interpretation of the translation that is given to the sheriff is, no white man can arrest me. The sheriff then reacts to this by shooting Gregorio's brother Ronaldo in the shoulder. Then Gregorio takes out his gun and shoots at the sheriff. Gregorio escapes, but his brother and his family were arrested. That included his brother, his wife, his mom, and his children. Eventually, Rolando ends up bleeding to death in jail. Cortes goes to his friend's ranch near Belmont, Texas, but the sheriff found him and they engaged in a gunfight. There, Gregorio would kill the sheriff and the landowner would be killed by the crossfire, and Gregorio Cortes escapes once more. By the way, there's a book called With His Pistol in His Hand that talks about this story. There's also a movie by the same name where Edward James Olmos plays Gregorio Cortes, if you want to watch that to learn more about Gregorio Cortes. Gregorio Cortes escapes the other sheriffs and evades the Texas Rangers for almost 2 weeks in total. Now he's wanted dead or alive. Eventually, a friend of Gregorio Cortes gives him up, and Gregorio Cortes is arrested. Gregorio Cortes is given a 50-year sentence, and he is eventually pardoned for good behavior and released in 1913. At this point, he decides to join the Mexican Revolution, and during the Mexican Revolution, Gregorio Cortes dies in 1916 in Mexico. The next part of this lecture is about Mexican Americans in the Civil War. The number of Mexican American people that fought in the U.S. Civil War is about 10,000. In the case of California, 40% of Anglos in California in the 1860s were from the southern region of the United States and were therefore sympathetic to the South. In 1861, California votes loyalty to the Union and puts together volunteers who would replace the regular army soldiers who are fighting in the Civil War. Californios and California Indians make up to 4 companies made up of 62 to 190 people. This makes up the 1st Battalion. This includes Yaqui Indians, Sonoran, people from Sonora, and Germans. 470 Mexican Americans serve in California, New Mexico, and Arizona territories. Their job is to patrol from the Colorado River to East Texas, to guard telegraph lines, to guard settlements, to protect travelers, and to capture army deserters into Sonora, Mexico. Their job is also to protect settlements from Indian raiding in Northern California and to engage in military campaigns against California Indians to secure the land for settlers. The Confederacy Army finds it as a great opportunity to invade the West and take the gold fields in Colorado, in California, and to take over the Santa Fe Trail, which is a very lucrative place for trade. In the case of New Mexico, a group of 300 Texans led by Lieutenant Colonel John R. Baylor take over the southern New Mexico settlement of Mesilla and claim it as part of the Confederate territory of Arizona. Later on, this place is reinforced by Tejanos from San Antonio, Eagle Pass, and Fort Clark under Baylor's 2nd Texas Mounted Rifles. The next idea was to engage in an invasion of New Mexico to use it as a jumping board into California, Utah, and Colorado. And this is the image that you see on the right, in which New Mexico is attacked by soldiers, Confederate soldiers from Texas. But in the battles of Valverde and Glorieta Paz, eventually the Union is able to stop this takeover. This 3-day battle that happens at Glorieta Paz is known as the Gettysburg of the West. And you are going to learn about this in one of your discussions where you learn about the role of Mexican American people, or actually Hispanics, in the Civil War. Most of Texas Confederate soldiers didn't participate in East Coast battles, but some thousands did. Tejanos, these few thousands, participated in 38 battles and scrimmages that concluded in Virginia in the battles of Gaines Mill, Second Bull Run, and Antietam. They lost at 60% of their numbers, and they also fought at Fredericksburg, Gettysburg, and Wilderness campaigns. Over 60 or more percent losses in many battles. Many people came from Webb, Refugio, and Bexar counties. The most recognized Mexican American Tejano in the Civil War was Santos Benavides, a pro-Confederate and a slave owner that was very influential in Laredo, Texas. He's able to rise to colonel and commander of the 33rd Texas Cavalry Regiment. He never loses a battle at the border region. He's known to have fought against Cortina and defeated him at the Battle of Carrizo in 1861. California is a Union state. Texas is a Confederate state. Eventually, the Civil War takes the lives of over 1 million people, or 3% of the U.S. population, including about 620,000 soldiers, whose deaths, about two-thirds of those deaths, are by disease, and also by the lack of medical equipment at this point. 1/4 of soldiers from Texas died in the Civil War. Half of those died due to infected or maltreatment of wounds or disease. Many Tejano sacrifices did not get any land under the headlight system, which is a system of rewards for fighting for Texas. Most Tejanos came back to Texas and they continue to experience violence, discrimination, segregation, anti-Mexican sentiment, and so on and so forth. Lynchings. Another role that Mexican American people have during this period is a role in fighting against Native American people in the period that we know as the period of the Indian Wars. New Mexico suffers from Navajo, Apache, and Plains Indians raids and attacks. Eventually, this leads to placing Indian nations into reservations and protecting trade routes from Indian attacks. Here we have images of Apache leader, medicine man, by the name of Boyantla, or Jeronimo, who was one of the last Apache leaders, not chief, but leaders that resisted the forced removal of traditional lands and the reservation system. Another group that also was forced into a reservation and resisted was the Navajos, or the Diné people. These groups were people that had experienced violence by the Spanish and the Mexican governments, and they will continue to experience this violence by the U.S. government. Many treaties signed, promises made, but not much was fulfilled by the United States. One group that was also influential in the Southwest was the Buffalo Soldiers. And cavalrymen that helped in forcing Native American people into reservations. The Southwest after the Civil War is a place that is without law and order. Many of these towns that are happening, whether they're mining towns or cattle ranching towns, are governed by people that put together vigilante committees to keep the peace. You have some sheriffs and marshals that act as the authority of the town, but at the same time, some of these people actually also engage in crime themselves. There's a social and racial order in which people of color are discriminated if they are allowed to work in these towns, or they're only expected to have certain roles in these towns. Many of these committees that are formed by citizens end up taking justice into their own hands and killing Native people. There are mining towns happening in Nevada, in Montana, in Arizona, and there's a population of people coming in. A very complex history and relationships between Anglos, Mexicans, and Native American people that we are going to talk about in the next lectures. The train is coming in, and that is going to change everything. Mexican American people are going to lose much of their land. They are going to go from a people that were in charge of the future of the Southwest to a people that become workers for the new people that are taking over the land. And that is it for this lecture. I will see you on the next one.